Hello and welcome to yet another podcast from the Sustainability Sisters. This is a part of knowledge sessions that we have been taking, as a part of which Sanchari and Prerna also discussed a lot of sustainability frameworks last week. My name is Smarika, and today I am going to be discussing the history of sustainability. So, let's begin. Sustainability. We hear that word a lot. Sustainable city, sustainable agriculture, sustainable development, sustainable food. And of course, we are also sustainability sisters. And we are using it almost like a mantra, perhaps too much. If we do a quick Google search, it's going to be returning 120 million hits. So, all of this excitement around sustainability, of course, makes it a buzzword. However, sustainability is much more than that. It has a rich, albeit brief, history of tackling problems, finding solutions, and new ways of thinking. So, let's look at the history of sustainability. Before we deep dive further, I want to start with why we are discussing all of this. So, some of you might already know the planet is facing its greatest crisis, and we simply cannot afford to stand by and do nothing. So, we are trying to educate as many people as possible so they understand sustainability better, take steps like reducing consumption or being conscious, consciously consuming, consciously living, and of course, ideating towards a better future and limiting global warming to maybe below 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. Here, there's this diagram where we are showing the number of Earths and the resources that are needed if world's population continues living like all of these countries. So our current patterns are unsustainable and we cannot continue at this rate, because at this rate, we are going to be requiring two Earths to sustain our lifestyle. There is a high demand of energy, food, and water to sustain the global population, and this will result in intensified land use, resource extraction, pollution, which is all responsible for climate change. And more people are now vulnerable to impacts of climate change, like coastal cities, and this increases a risk of human and economic loss. And almost a lot of manpower now is focused towards transitioning towards a low carbon economy. So now let's deep dive into the history and this topic we are going to be discussing in detail further. So sustainability as a word became famous from 1987 United Nations report, which was also called the Brundtland Report, and it defined sustainability or sustainable development as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs, and especially the needs of the poor. So, this definition implies that we need to pay attention to Earth's natural limits so that people can maintain a good quality of life well into the future for our kids also. And it was this report that popularized the word. However, uh, even though sustainability movement is relatively young, only late 1970s and 1980s after industrialization, after UN got behind the concept of sustainable developments, but the term dates back to early 1700s. These ideas were born during the European Enlightenment. So during early 1700s, sustainability has its roots in European Enlightenment. A person named Hans Karl von Karlowitz, who was a Saxon mining administrator, he coined this term Nachhaltigkeit or sustainability in German. and he advocated sustainable management of forests in context of a timber crisis that had gripped the Saxony in many parts of Europe. And Karlovid's he ran a profitable silver mines in Saxony, and it relied on a steady stream of trees to keep the heat going for the mining shafts and many other things. And it was before coal began to displace timber. So Karlovitz has written a treatise on the need to conserve forest and use them sustainably. Karl von Karlowitz at that time and other Europeans, they wrote multiple books and treatises on sustainable forestry to establish sustainability as kind of a belief system. But that was drowned out by the clinking sounds of primitive machines and noisy rush towards industrialization. The whole idea of sustainability at that time was that human society must live within their limits, and not only just live within their limits, but thrive within their limits. Even though the term dates back to European Enlightenment, but it's not Europeans who have invented it. Therefore, historical analysis of the term is the first step in developing a greater understanding of the theories and principles of sustainability. So, from here onwards, the presentation is in three parts, starting with the early concepts and practices. The second part is the Industrial Revolution, and the third one is the post World War II economic expansion. So, let's look at the indigenous sustainable practices. So long before European Enlightenment, indigenous societies like the Highlanders of New Guinea lived sustainably for tens of thousands of years. Their practices were inherently sustainable, ensuring balance with nature. There were other societies, and even before societies, during prehistoric times, when we used to live as hunters and gatherers, human population used to grow only within means. They had only a confined piece of land or natural resources around them, which started to dwindle. And some people moved away in search of new lands and new resources, while others decided to settle on their land and to breed their animals and harvest plants. So, the principle of sustainability for these people was either to leave their land and allow its natural resources to replenish, or to live within their means. There were other civilizations. Aztecs, they were the early examples of civilizations that practiced sustainable agriculture. So they decided to settle for a sedentary agricultural lifestyle, which was known as agrarian urbanism. And for Aztecs, sustainability was recycling, viewing waste as a valuable human resource, which can be bought and sold. So they bought and sold food, leftovers, crop residue, even human feces. So they had very stringent recycling practices. Economy was competitive, reduced waste, and kept the cities clean. So even in Indian literature, it's evident that there has been a rich history of sophisticated, holistic methods of sustainability, and they've always been encouraged and practiced. For example, in both Buddhism and Jainism and some sects of Hinduism, they practice non-violence and biological conservation. The killing of animals and cutting trees is absolutely prohibited. And Jainism, you cannot even kill insects. So in Indian literature, it's rich with the word sustainability. So Rabindranath Tagore, in his essay Tapovan or Forest Purity, wrote that Indian civilization has been distinctive in locating its source of regeneration. and intellectual and material is in forest and not in the city. India's best ideas have come from when man was in communion with the trees and rivers and lakes, away from the crowd. And even in Africa, from 6000 BCE to current local traditions, there has always been a tight bond that exists between environment and the people, the Buntas, semi-Buntas, Sudanese tribes of Cameroon and Central Africa. They have great examples which have passed down the knowledge of sustainability down generations, and they have learned to effectively manage their agricultural lands using crop rotation, mixed cropping without exploiting it. Hunting is only accessible to veteran hunters who are allocated confined spaces of land. Farming and logging are banned from sacred parts of forests. People grow fruit bearing trees around their houses and farms to maximize land use. On the contrary, if we look at other cultures like Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman, these civilizations also face sustainable problems such as deforestation, loss of soil fertility, excess farming, and logging. They were also aware of all of these problems. They suggested maintaining everlasting youth of the earth and taking care of earth by lessening evil effects and such practices. However, history has shown us that these civilizations they often conquer new land to replenish their depleting resources. So when we look at all of these historical examples of sustainability, sustainable development, and theories and principles all have been deeply embedded in rich cultures of many civilizations. From efficiently recycling their resources, creating a competitive economy, conserving nature as a part of religious beliefs, and practicing local sustainability traditions which have been passed down hundreds of generations, and they are advocating against unsustainable practices. So it's very clear that history is full of examples of sustainable development, which we currently in our model civilization can learn from them. So the solution is not to search for a single definition of sustainability, or theory, or principle of sustainability, but it is to learn and implement sustainable practices from our rich ancestral history and rather than reinventing the entire wheel. So now let's discuss the Industrial Revolution and the early environmentalism. So we have discussed that sustainability has its roots dating back to the early 1700s. It's not a modern invention, and the sustainable concepts have existed before, even before that, during prehistoric times. So during Industrial Revolution, uh, this sustainability movement came into existence because in fact it is an unsustainable society that really needs a sustainability movement, isn't it? So the unsustainable use of resources and the social and economic impacts during early phases of this industrial revolution sparked an interest in sustainability in Europe, and this period marked a pivotal point for modern sustainability movement. So this Enlightenment period was a paradox. On one hand, it gave rise to capitalism and industrialization. On the other hand, it also planted the seeds of sustainability. So there were Adam Smith's economic theories and the advent of machines like steam engine, which propelled industrial growth, but it also highlighted the need for sustainable practices. So the philosopher John Stuart Mill, he introduced the idea of stationary state in the mid 19th centuries. It suggests that economic growth should not continue indefinitely, but rather stabilize, promoting happiness and prosperity. So This idea that economic growth should not continue indefinitely, but it should rather culminate in a stationary state. Then coming to the early environmentalists such as John Muir, and these environmentalists understood that industrial growth could have a really negative impact on the natural world. They understood that environmental economies and social well being were intimately connected. And this is really the origin of three E's of sustainability, which is the main model for this belief system. So, which is also a basis of triple bottom line: environment, economy, and social equity. So they emphasized interconnectedness of environment, economy, and social well being. So this brings us to the part three, which is post World War II economic expansion and modern environmental movements. So after 1945, which is after the end of World War II, golden age of capitalism began. It saw unprecedented industrial and commercial expansion. However, this period also resulted in rapid population growth, pollution, and resource depletion, which led to an increased awareness of environmental issue. In 1962, Rachel Carlson published a book, Silent Spring, and this was a turning point in environmental awareness. It exposed the dangers of pesticides, sparking public outcry and igniting the environmental movement in the Western world. And by the 1960s, the idea of continuous progress and rapid capitalism was also losing its sheen. People started to see progress for what it is: a justification for the reign of free market, colonial exploitation of non Western society, and a complete disregard for the biosphere. So, this publication of the book Silent Spring in 1962 was a turning point for the Western population. So during 1968, during the first trip to orbit the moon, astronauts snapped a photo called Earthrise. It was the first time that the world saw Earth from such a distance. And this image had a profound effect on people, and this is considered to be the most influential environmental photograph ever taken. And many consider it to be the spark that started the modern day environmental movement. So 1960s and 1970s witnessed the rise of influential environmental movements and organizations like Friends of Earth, Greenpeace, who brought attention to global environmental issues. There was also the birth of critical environmental movements like Dasholingam Swarajya Sangh, the labor cooperative started by Chandi Prasad Bhatt, which led to Chipko movement and non-violent forest conservation movement in India, which became a rallying point for future environmental problems all over the world. And there was Green Belt movement in Nairobi, Kenya, which was a community led holistic movement on preventing desertification by planting trees, community development, and capacity building. So the 1960s and 1970s saw all of this frenzy, environmental movement, people recognizing that industrialism is all not so good and there are impacts on society, there are impacts on environment, there has to be a sustainable development, which brings us to the part four. So the part four is global environmental governance and sustainable development. So there was a United Nations Conference on Environment held in Stockholm in 1972, which marked a significant step in global environmental governance and led to the establishment of United Nations Environmental Program. And so, despite the momentum gained from the Stockholm Conference in 1972, in the following years, the global environmental challenges were not adequately addressed. And the main reason that was cited, that no major country in the world was willing to give up on their environmental growth, whether they are developing countries or developed countries. So, which brings us to the Brundtland Commission, which we discussed at the starting itself. In 1983, United Nations created the Brundtland Commission to save the environment and natural resources and prevent the deterioration of economic and social development. The chairperson of the commission was Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the former Prime Minister of Norway. And the people behind this commission had sensed the widespread feeling of frustration and inadequacy among the global population towards the United Nations' inability to address the global issues and deal effectively with them. The iconic contribution of this commission was publishing this report, which is called Our Common Future, which popularized this word, sustainable development. Which brings us to the modern challenge of finding a balance, living within our environmental limits while retaining the benefits of modern civilization. The question is really, can we have our cake and eat it too? To recap, what we have learned today is we have explored the historical roots of sustainability, the role of indigenous practices, the Enlightenment's dual legacy, and the modern challenges. Learning from history and implementing sustainable practices is really crucial. So, with that, I invite you to join our community of Sustainability Sisters for more resources and discussions to create a sustainable future. Thank you.